Notice is hereby given that a work session of the Salem-Keizer School Board District 24J of Marion County, Salem, Oregon is called for 6 p.m. Tuesday, January 27, 2015 in Room 2, the Support Services Center, 2575 Commercial Street, Southeast, Salem, Oregon. This meeting is called for discussion on the results policy, and let the record show that all school board members are present, and we also invited the members of the Budget Committee to attend to get some information for our discussions later in the year. And I see a couple Budget Committee members here, Larry Trott and Mark Bateman. Anybody I'm missing? No? Okay, thanks for coming, guys. The objective of this work session is to review the results policy for potential changes, and I'm going to turn it over to Superintendent Perry.
All right, can I do one audience introduction first? Mr. Parshall, would you introduce our guests this evening?
Thank you. We are very honored to have Mr. Zhu with us, who is a visiting middle school principal from Xi'an City in China. And he is spending the week in our district. So looking forward to watching the school board. In China, they do not have school boards. And so he's very interested in watching our process tonight and the role that elected officials play in our school system.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to dive in, and then we'll save kind of discussion for the end. And what I'm going to ask you to consider as we go along in the process is if you were thinking something should be in the results policy, what might that be in a bullet point, and what data might we have that could give us that indicator in our results policy? So I'm just think about that in terms of as we're talking through this tonight. So I'm going to do just a little bit of background and just to remind you about Carver's perspective on results. For it to be considered a result, it must describe what good, for whom, or, and the or is important because a lot of times we won't answer this question in our results policy, is at what cost. Unless it describes what good, for whom, or at what cost, it's not considered a result, regardless of how important it is, who decides it, how closely it relates to an organizational goals, strategies, mission, or perceived board work. So if you think about, let's take CTE Center, important, and we're passionate about it, and we think all are involved in the work of the CTE Center. Building the CTE Center is not a result. It's a means, it's an issue. It's something that we believe in, yet doesn't go in the results policy, building a CTE Center. So it's not language about what we as an organization are doing or about what I'm doing as the superintendent. Remember also that my evaluation is related to the results policy. So I'm going to give you some examples beyond the CTE Center. So a good results statement could say, which is really, this one's really similar to one in your results policy, the percentage of students meeting or exceeding the benchmark for math will increase. That's a result. A means, or the way we get there, provide teachers with high quality professional development related to Common Core state standards for math. That's from our strategic plan. A great thing to be doing, an important thing for me to monitor. Doesn't end up in the results policy though, because it's not a result. Other than it's something we could check off a list that we did. Another result would be the graduation rates will increase. Again, that's from your results policy. A means might be any student at risk of dropping out will have access to a graduation coach. So we have graduation coach. That's a means to an end or a result of an increase in high school graduation rate. You think about full day K, spending a lot of time on it. You're going to begin hearing reports on it. Not a result. It's a means. So, and it might be the result is percentage of students meeting or exceeding third grade reading benchmarks will increase. The means or a strategy we're going to use is to implement full day K. And the only thing you're going to monitor are the things in the results policy, according to Carver, as long as we're under policy governance. So I wanted to remind you also that just because we have limited things in the results policy it isn't the only way you get or can get information. So you get the executive limitations monthly, which is also part of my evaluation. You get annual reports on student achievement, which is our summative student achievement data. And in those annual reports on student achievement, there are pieces of that report that would tell you whether you are meeting your results policy. But there's also lots of things in that presentation that aren't part of your results policy. So, and then you have all kinds of additional data that you receive that are related to issues, not results. We might see some, based on some kindergarten, pre-kindergarten work that we're doing, that we'll see an increase in kindergarten readiness. But increase in kindergarten readiness probably doesn't go in the results policy because we can't impact them really across the board before they get to us. So that's what we've got to think about as we have this discussion around results, the results policy. And I went back into the minutes of the things you've discussed in the past around the results policy. And I do think you've had really pretty rich discussions about results policy, but in the end, each time you've kind of landed on a similar results policy. If we land on a similar results policy this time, what I'm also going to ask you is, what other data is it important that you know about and monitor? And maybe at some point that goes in a results policy, but it might not go right away. So the questions I'd like us to discuss as a board are, does the board receive enough data related to how we are meeting our goals as described in the current results policy, and to evaluate the superintendent? Does this information help the board communicate with various audiences you interact with? And is your results policy clear and focused on the appropriate measures of student achievement? So that's what I'm going to open up to begin a little bit of discussion about.
Christy's controlling the meeting, so she's going to
So-
be picking who.
Yep. So actually, let's just start with around the room. Jeff, do you want to answer any one of those questions? You can say skip and I can come back to you too.
I think that we get I think we have enough information to evaluate the superintendent and to evaluate the direction of the district. I would like to, personally, I'd like to see a clearer options or changes that we make based on anything that's not up to par, not up to what we want to see. I want to make sure that we have a clear new direction, or a clear direction or change or something, so that we don't continue in any mistakes that we're making.
So would that be an example of looking at our third grade reading like we did and thinking about should we call that out in the results policy, or are you thinking about maybe other operational things that you'd like to see in a different place?
Well, if we're looking at the means, I like to see whenever we evaluate the results, to always evaluate the direction and whether or not we need to change. So I just want that to be part of the process.
Okay. When we come back to that, I'm going to ask if you could think of an example. Okay, Chuck.
You know, I excuse me, kind of brought this up before, and basically I'm very comfortable with what we've got and where we're going. I wanted to say that at the beginning. I think a lot of times I question, we will have a report on results policies or whatever at like an October meeting in a particular area, and we're in compliance. Everything's in compliance. And how do we as a board know in April that something else has come up since then that we don't know about? So I think it's kind of the way in which we do it month by month by month. And I can see we're in October, we're in compliance with one particular policy. And we don't really look at it again in April to see if it's still the case.
So on the executive limitations side of it, you'd like a place where in our calendar that we revisit all the previous executive limitations to ask me, have there been any?
Yeah, I think all I would need would be, when we do that, is to say, since, as we go through the current month limitations, to go back and say, so far, we are still in compliance with all of the previous limitations. We haven't really gotten that feedback. We're still in compliance with the ones that have gone before it.
Okay. Thanks. Paul?
I agree with Chuck that I know, it's hard to believe. It's rare, it's rare.
That's fair.
That,
Let that be on the record.
Yeah, exactly. I think the policies are working well. I also have concerns that we only see the result once a year. And I guess the other piece of that, to go a little bit further, is I'm waiting to see one that we're out of compliance on, because they're structured in such, I don't trust the data, because everything is, we live in fantasy land, because everything is so perfect that there are no problems.
So, and you're talking in terms of executive limitations
Yes.
again, not the results policy.
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
Nancy?
Well, I think in the time I've been on the board, that we've had executive limitation reports that have said that we were out of compliance in this and that, and this is what we're doing to make sure that that doesn't happen. So maybe it hasn't happened in your time on the board, but I do think that we've seen times where everything wasn't presented as perfect. I also think it's important to keep in mind that
Microphone.
I didn't really get one. Okay. I think it's important to keep in mind that the duties of the superintendent are enormous, and we have these 12 executive limitations that are not, there's a small but important part of what the job is, and they're the sorts of things that you would assume in the normal process of the work would not be done. Well, that's, I want to talk about the results policy. So I have something I'm interested in, not for the results policy, but for information that I would like us to get, that we could begin to think about if there's a place for it ever to go in the results policy, and that would be what it is that our graduating seniors are planning in terms of going straight to work, going to the military, going to two-year college, going to four-year college, going straight to medical school, you know. Yeah.
And what would be the purpose?
So that we would have a baseline to know if we're anywhere near the target of 40-40-20.
Okay.
And that if we're nowhere near 40-40-20, then maybe we need to put it in the results to be looking at how we're going to help kids to get into those buckets in the right numbers.
Okay. Rick?
I will. I'll go to the results policy. I'm pretty satisfied with how it's written right now, but a piece I would like to see, I don't know if this is the year for it, is a way to measure the effectiveness of all-day kindergarten once it's instituted. I mean, if we have some baseline that tells us where we're at today and the impact all-day kindergarten has, whatever that measurement is, 2 years from now or 3 years from now, so.
And since,
That leads into 40-40-20 also. I'm getting them ready sooner will certainly help. So.
and could it be something that you want to look at as information but doesn't immediately land in the results
I think
policy?
it has to be information right now because we don't even know what that baseline is, but
Okay.
it would be something to start thinking about to meld in there sometime.
Okay.
That's it for me.
Chris?
I think my two biggest problems with the results policy as we currently have it is that it seems to leave a lot of things that we do in our schools out. I guess a good way to say that is that there isn't periodically some information about how our kids are doing in science through the state testing, and that will go away with the Common Core because they don't have a science test. And so our civics education, our social studies and general history, economics, those kinds of things, we don't know how our kids are doing. And so I think one of my biggest issues is just that I think we need information on how our kids are doing in areas that aren't directly covered through smarter balanced testing. And we get some of that, of course, through whether they're graduating or not, because in order to graduate, you have to have passed a certain number of courses in these areas. And so we get a little bit of that, but we don't really get any detail. And the reason that I'm trying to broaden this idea out to where we're going is we continue to get feedback all the time from community colleges and universities that our kids are coming underprepared, and that a lot of kids are having to go through remedial classes, which don't get them credit, but that they have to pay for in order to catch up on their basic college-level skills. And so I think there's a disconnect in a way with what we're measuring and whether or not it's the right stuff to measure to actually determine whether they're ready for college. Smarter Balance may help that. According to what I read, in order to pass the Smarter Balanced writing, math, and reading assessments at the 11th grade level, students will be, if they do pass it, will be on track to be college ready, four-year college ready. So what about the kids who don't pass it? Are they still tech training ready? Are they still ready to go to chiropractor school? I don't, how do we determine whether we have the right, I'm with Nancy on, how do we determine if we have the right number of kids in our school or percentage of our kids who are ready to go into four-year college, and then that many more who are ready to go into technical training? How do we determine that? What measures do we have that tell us that a student is ready maybe for a technical training, but not necessarily ready for a four-year college experience?
So I'm hearing two separate things. One is around information on how kids are doing in other areas besides reading, writing, math. And then the second one is college readiness, if I were to boil it down.
And college readiness in its broadest sense, meaning tech training being part of college, yeah.
College and career readiness.
Right. And I would love to know, like Nancy would like to know where they're going. I know that our state schools have the ability to tell us how our students did in their first year in state schools. I would love to know, are the students from Salem-Keizer in general ready for college level work, or are a lot of our students taking remedial work? How are we doing in terms of them being ready for the next step?
So you want to go ahead?
I just want to clarify something that Chris said. So at the beginning of what he said is that he hears all the time that our kids aren't ready for college work.
Our kids in the broad sense, not saying.
That's what I wanted to clarify. Do we have data about how our kids are doing?
Right.
So you weren't making the statement that we know for sure.
Salem-Keizer
that
kids
the
are in trouble.
Salem-Keizer kids are not, okay.
No, that, community colleges will tell you regularly that they're having an awful lot of kids having to take remedial coursework. Are those Salem-Keizer kids? Are those, not Salem-Keizer kids? That's a good question for me to know in terms of, are we preparing kids for the next step?
So I have a follow-up. What you're describing to me, I think, is information. I'm not hearing you say explicitly it has to be in the results policy.
I think it would evolve into it as Nancy says, we don't even have a baseline, so we don't have any way to know if things are improving, staying the same, or getting worse. We just know at this point that we hear these things. I would like to have some data that actually says what's happening.
And that falls in under bullet number 2. Does the information we give you help the board communicate with various audience? So when you hear that, you can't say, but Salem-Keizer students persist in the first year of college at a higher rate than,
Yeah, we're doing better than the rest of you.
yeah,
That kind of stuff. No, I don't have that information. It would be nice to have.
okay. Not information, not results, right now.
I would love to see it in results. Are we ready to put it there, or do we have the right kind of data? I don't know that. That's something the district has to bring us. Or do you have measures
Right.
now that would be able to better inform us of that? If not, can those measures be developed, would be the next question. And until we know that, A, we have them, and B, that they're good measures, it can't be put in the result
Okay.
policy.
Okay. Jim?
So, a couple of things looking at the results policy we first have. Maybe I'm not remembering it, but I don't remember getting reports on the long-term goal that we've got in our results policy. We have our annual goals, but we haven't gotten that result on the ultimate goal of the school board is that individual students will make 1 year of academic progress each year. That's a pretty big data grab. I mean, that's a lot of work on behalf of staff when you've got 40,000 kids.
Right.
But I don't remember getting a lot of data around that. I was looking through my stuff today, and it's really not even built into the achievement compact. But if that's our long-term goal, I think we need to get some information on that or work with staff on how we can get that type of information for the board in a usable form without putting, the burden on staff to gather that from 40,000 students. But if that's our long-term goal, we should be monitoring that in
Right.
some way. And we should also use that in your evaluation. If it's our long-term goal, we should be using that in your evaluation process.
So I'm going to turn to Mary to ask her, as the historian. How was that? Has the board gotten that information?
No. No, at the time that was your long-term goal, there was not a efficient way
Right.
to measure. And so that is a vision statement to some degree as well, so.
Yeah, and I understand that, but if we've got it there as a goal, we either need to recognize that it's part of our vision statement and not have it as a goal. Because if I'm reading this and I go to our website and read it, it reads as a goal. The other thing I would say, Christy, so bear with me a little bit. I'm going to go work through your questions here. With regard to the information, does it help me communicate with the various audiences I interact with? To be honest with you, the interactions I have with community members and folks out in the class and teachers and parents and whoever I interact with, they ask more means-related questions than they do ends-related questions, except for days like today and Thursday when they see the graduation rates come out. Everything else is related to, do we have enough of the curriculum necessary in second grade? Why the heck are we not putting turf fields on all of our high school fields? All the means stuff. And those are ones that I know take a lot of time on behalf of staff, when I have to call and say, hey, I got this constituent, I got this parent. But really, more audience communication that I get is more on the means stuff rather than resulting in the ends type of work that we do at the board level.
Okay.
If we look at what we've currently got, I think for the annual goals under number 1, we just need to update the language. I mean, some of that's kind of outdated language because it was somewhat crafted when No Child Left Behind was in its heat. The other thing I would say is if we were looking for information that I would want to see related to what we do, I'd like information on our academic achievement related to our identified poverty students, and I know we get some of that. Our ELPA scores, because if you look at our demographics of our district, we are becoming a minority-majority school district, and poverty is a huge factor in our school district, and I'd like to know a little bit more about those, what we title economically disadvantaged students, ELPA and the ELPA scores and how we're moving kids through, and then also data on the EVER ELL students and looking at those type of things. The other one that we don't have in here, and we added number 2 in the 11-12 year, which is the high school completion. And I like high school completion rather than four-year cohort. And we have kids on different scales. We have different programs to address that. One that we don't have in here that I think is a critical measuring for us is our dropout rate. And I know we can never get it to 0, but we should be focusing on it somewhere. And we've touted what we've done at McKay and our other high schools, and our dropout rate has dramatically gone down over time, but we don't use it as an ultimate scale. And it may be something we want to take a look at putting in our results policy. Really, I think it's on the appropriate measures of student achievement. The problem is it's based on it's going to all be based on smarter balanced assessment, which is the summative assessments, which we know can be used as a measuring stick, and that's what we're going to be used with our policymakers. But you know, there's more formative assessments going on day in and day out in our classrooms that really tell us what our students are doing, and more importantly, it informs instruction probably better than some of these summative assessments. So I know we've got to be tied to that, but I want to make sure we keep our eye on the prize of what we cherish in our school district rather than what the state tells us to cherish, which is, are you getting your third graders at 70% meeting the standard? I want to make sure all our third graders read at the end of third grade, you know, those type of things. But I think we need to update the language. With communication, it's more means-based that I see rather than ends-based. And with regard to the policy as it's currently written, we need to update it, maybe add some things around our ELL and our dropout.
Okay.
And I think it does work, although this year's a little bit different because you're 6 months in, and I think we wrote that into your contract to not
Yep.
do the evaluation based on it for this year because you're living with the ramifications of Sandy's legacy and Paula being here for the year as well. But in the evaluations that we've done in the past of Sandy, I think it did help. As long as board members focused on the results policy and used that as the basis for the tool of the evaluation, I think it did focus the energy where we needed it to go.
Okay.
Piece of information that I heard another district does, and I think it would help me, and that is that Hillsborough has a similar principal evaluation system to ours, which is logical because Steve took it up there. But what they do is they compile the goals that each of their schools have set up. Their principals have said, this year our schools are going to improve in this or that way. Let's say it's a high school and they say, oh, we want to have more kids involved in AP courses or something. That obviously, if the supervisor and the principal believe that this is something that's going to make our school better and move our kids forward, then that's a goal that would be interesting to the board to know about, along with, did they get there? Just knowing more about what's going on in our buildings between the supervisors and the principals would be a really nice piece of information for me to have.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask, oh, sorry. Nancy.
I'm sorry. Jim said something that made me think about if there is any pieces of information that would be helpful in communicating to the public as we roll out Smarter Balance, and we expect that nationwide the results on Smarter Balance are going to not be impressive, and that we probably won't be any different than everyone else. Do we have some mechanism that we can use to say we have confidence our students are moving forward? And I don't know if you have.
And that gets to that long-term goal where we're
Right.
talking about
Right.
1 year of academic progress each year.
Right. And I have a friend who teaches math in the middle school, and examples that she has been using with sixth graders have been pushed to the third grade. So I would think that all along the line, the third graders who are getting, and I think we're a little bit ahead in that we've been instituting these standards. We didn't just start this year, but that these are pretty big changes to expect kids to be where they need to be at the beginning of all this.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask a question of board members. What did you hear any of your colleagues say that you think should be added to the results policy? I heard a couple things, but I'll.
As it went around, several people said 40-40-20. I think we need to make our results policy responsible to 40-40-20 in some way. In other words, be able to say, this district is moving our students ahead in the right ratios of people into technical training, college training, whatever.
And is that for results policy now, or is that for information now to see what are the information sources?
When you say now, are we talking next? I would say next year, yes. If it's possible for the district to come back to us with, here's how we would measure that. And by the end of this year, we as a board were to say, let's start looking at those measures next year. If that's what you mean by now, I think that could happen now.
So let me ask everyone else, would everyone agree with that?
So I'm going to say no, and my reason isn't because we shouldn't be focused on it. It's probably on my knowledge of how 40-40-20 was created, that there's not real scientific data or research around there that that's the actual mix of ratio that you ought to have. It was a state policy. It's part of our state law. I understand that. But that may not be what our students in a particular grade level, in a particular school, may ever make up. I mean, it's a great goal, don't get me wrong, but when you ask the policymakers behind why was 40-40-20 picked, I've not ever had anybody give me research or data that shows those are the proper and correct ratios.
So let me try again then, because I agree with him. I totally agree with him. That, in fact, we're the most, from what I can have read, we are the most ambitious state in the union in terms of our goal. That 40-40-20 is much higher than most states are looking at. Maybe what I'm asking then is to not tie it directly to 40-40-20, but to tie it to some measure of what percentage of our students are prepared to go ahead to a four-year institution, what percentage of our kids are ready for technical training. Maybe not tie it to 40-40-20, but simply say it would be helpful to us to know what our students are ready for and what they're doing next. Sort of where Nancy was going.
But I didn't ask that it be put into results policy. I would like it to come back to us to see where we are and to see whether it's something that rises to the need of being in results policy.
So I asked for a couple things specifically. Do you want me to say what I asked for? Or?
Yeah, let's finish this.
Okay.
Would we have consensus that it should go in the 40-40-20 should go in results policy? No. Okay.
And I wouldn't say 40-40-20 anymore based on what James
Okay. And so, but perhaps we might have, would we have consensus on it's important for us to have the information about what are our kids prepared for?
Yes, but I
Okay.
think that's a means.
Yeah, so not results.
Correct.
Right.
So the first thing is we would like information on how are our kids prepared and what sort of data can we easily grab about that?
Can I ask for a clarification as why do
Yes.
you think that's means?
Because I believe that that's data that we need and we want. I think the bigger piece is we already have it there, that they're, I mean, I'm looking here, I'm reading the vision. I mean, all students are gonna graduate. You're asking, they graduated, so what? What happens to them afterwards? That's just the next extension. That's the next layer. That's why it's a means as opposed to a standalone result.
And I see it as I see it as an end simply because it's the end of our influence on them as a school district. And if we prepare them so that they are ready for four-year schools, or technical training or going straight to work, then that's our end. That's what we do as a K-12 system. So that's why I see it as an end.
So right now I hear that's as an information. Okay. Jim, You did ask for a couple things.
Yeah, I asked for data on, well, I think we ought to have something on dropout or dropout rate. And I'd like to, and we've got it in there, but it doesn't reflect how we test our English language learners. We don't see, or we do see, but we don't use it in this, our ELPA scores. And are we exiting students out of our ELPA, using the data and everything we have with regard to that? So those were the two things that I remember asking for.
So dropout rate, important in the results policy.
How would it be? I want to know how it would be stated.
Well, that's the next step. I just, is,
okay.
in general, is that important to put in the, to think about putting in the results policy? Because that will be our next step.
I could agree with that.
Jeff? You
I
can
don't
go ahead.
know.
Okay.
And I'm not saying, I'm not saying by that we get to zero, because that's not, that's like saying we're gonna graduate 100% of our kids. We'd love to do that. We're not gonna do that. But I think we need to be mindful of our dropout rate, that we keep it below a state level, a national level, below some, because initially when I got on the budget committee, 8 years ago now, our dropout rate was not anything we could really brag about. Now our dropout rate is something we can brag about. And I'm not trying to use it as an end result policy to brag about it. I think we need to keep our eye on the ball with regard to what's going on with our dropout rate.
Okay. Kelly, did you have a comment?
I'm just wondering if it might be helpful before the board decides whether it would be information or results to truly understand, to study what the dropout rate is comprised of, what kinds of data points need to go into that rate, so you could decide how much control does the school or the district have over the factors that go into a student dropping out. That might
Yeah.
help.
Yeah, and Kelly, I know the difficulty with regard to the dropout rate. Like, I think we still count GEDs as dropout. Do we still do that at the state level?
They actually can count in the completion rate.
They can't, I think we may want to look at, Salem-Keizerizing that dropout, so that we're not just looking at the state, so that we're looking at all the programs
Yep.
we have that feed into that. Because I think as long as we, Roberts, we've got early learning, we've got early college, we've got a variety of programs. And at some point, the state classifies some of those kids as dropouts, and I don't classify those as dropouts.
Well, the other budget piece of this is those programs cost us.
Sure they do.
And it is important to keep your eye on that target that does it really give us a greater high school completion. So let's go ahead, Paul.
But what you just said, it gives us a greater high school completion, isn't that just corollary to, or a subunit of, to show that if the dropout rate's decreasing, the graduation rate must be increasing, so isn't it just, again, another means data information point?
Paul, it may be.
I'm
Yeah.
just,
And I don't have a problem if the board doesn't want to do it. I just think it's an important data point that we need to keep our eye on.
And it
I
either
agree-
needs
I
to go
agree
in
that
form
we need
of,
the data.
yeah.
I just see it as, it folds in, it seems
Okay.
like to me.
So dropout rate, we're going to come back, and that's a potentially in, or at least as information. Rick?
Two things. First, Jim, when you said ever ELL earlier, you meant students that are always in ELL when you?
No, because once you hit an ELPA 5, you're exited out of the ELL. But we are still required to monitor them.
Okay.
But one of the data points we're seeing at state level stuff now is how are those ever ELL students doing? And actually, to be honest with you, the data shows their graduation rate's pretty good. It actually outperforms non-ELL students. And I'm not saying that's a results policy. I'm saying it's information we need to have to take a look at how our ELL. But I'd like to get more information. I don't know that it needs to be results on our ELPA scores as well.
Okay.
And how we're doing with that.
As the
Go ahead.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Rick?
it does.
Okay.
But if you're going to ask about the same topic, go ahead. I'll go back to dropout.
I was under the impression, it could be mistaken impression, that the state was changing the way it looked at ELL, so that there was gonna be a measure from the state that included those kids who began as ELLs and followed their progress instead of just, and when you look at the high school ELLs, there's such a small proportion of the kids that started in the program with ELLs. So it looks like, you know, the N of our ELLs goes down as you go up in grades. And so you have this smaller number at the end. And they're defining, those kids that are ELLs in high school are defining for the community our success with ELLs, because the kids who are in 6th grade who were once ELLs and are now no longer ELLs aren't counted in that ELL number, or they may be for a year or two. But I was under the impression that the state was recognizing that that was a problem and there was going to be some kind of change in the way that those numbers were looked at. Is that true? Boy, I'm sorry I went on for so long about that, just before I asked that question.
I think there are a couple of different ways that the state is monitoring and demonstrating concern and care for students and their ability to acquire English effectively and rapidly. So you'll see that reflected in the annual measurable achievement outcomes. And we can describe those in greater detail at some point, how those get measured. And then also, I do believe that there is some discussion going on in the state superintendent's recommendations for school funding that would support ELL programs.
Okay, back to the dropout rate question. For me, the results policy, as I think for all of us, is the big driver of the budget, right? I mean, it's what we plan the budget around. It's one of the reasons we have the budget committee here tonight, so they can hear this discussion, because this drives the budget. But if we put in dropout rate in the results policy as a bullet item, and it ends up taking resources from achieving a better graduation rate or completion rate, or better scores for all the students in all testing, then I wouldn't want to stick it in there. So it's, you know, it's kind of a judgment call whether we do that or not. So right now, I'd say graduation rate's enough for me, and that combining those, looking at those two together. So
So I hear a maybe on results or on dropout rate. We're going to come back with information. Information around ELPA and our ever ELLs. Maybe that will roll into results, maybe not. I also heard you say, Jim, academic achievement of kids in poverty. And I think it's there.
It's there, it's just we need to
call it out a
Yeah,
little.
we need to call it out, because we're
Okay.
seeing, if you look at the demographics of our district, we're seeing an increase in our poverty. We're seeing an increase in our ELL students and our students of color. I just want to keep focused on that.
Yeah.
Those are the kids that we have, not just Salem-Keizer, but we have traditionally not done the best with. And I don't know if we put in there about ELPA, you know, that we get to ELPA 5, I don't know. But
Right.
It's something I think we need to discuss.
And bring back, let's look
Yeah.
at what that data looks like. Okay, was there anything else anyone heard that you think should be in results? Jeff?
It's probably just or it could be just a means, but Jim mentioned 1 year growth, and that was stated as a goal, and put that out there as maybe something we should try to use as a goal, since it's written that way. That to
yeah.
me is one of the most important things, that everybody's making at least a year's growth each year.
Okay, so what we'll come back with is that possible to share results on that? And therefore, then do we make it a vision statement instead of a goal if it's not? So I have that on the list. Chuck first. Is that okay?
I just, I don't have the answer to this, or I'm just sitting here thinking about all this, but where does CTE fit into the results policy? Does it fit in? I mean,
It's a means.
CT is a means
Yeah.
to career ready.
And graduation rate, engaging kids that
So she just said the key word, that's career ready. What do we measure that tells us if our students are graduating career ready?
And I'm just wondering if there's a spot if there should be a spot in the results policy regarding CTE and what the results of our programs are.
And that's sort of coming back to what I was advocating for, getting away from the percentages, but just looking at students that are ready to go on to four-year, kids that are ready to go on for tech training, kids who are ready to go to work. What are our percentages? How are our students doing, and are we happy with those?
And maybe it starts as, let's get information and look at what information we have, then we decide, does it ultimately become a result, or is it just ongoing information that we want to monitor?
Just brought it up.
Yep, no, I think it's, I've wondered about that. Rick, sorry.
To go back to what Jim and Jeff were talking about on the 1 year's growth for each student, go back a little bit further in time, back when the board first adopted policy governance. One of the areas we were really interested in for the results policy is knowing that every kid was making 1 year's progress. And we didn't have the tools to measure it then. Tools were perhaps be in place, a data warehouse, formative assessments that may allow us to do that. So in the first few years of results policy, we just held off on even talking about potentially measuring that because we didn't have the tools, waiting for the tools to be there, the appropriate tools. We may not have them yet, so I think it's a good question to ask on whether.
I agree. We should come back with, can we measure that?
Let's ask one more question that's related to that. Is it possible that we could have that and the percentage of our students who have made suitable progress towards being on grade level? In other words, what I'm saying is, we all know that our students who are behind grade level, who are there because of whatever reason, with our students, a lot of it's ELL, there are measures, and those students do have sort of, in order to get by fifth grade to where they need to be, they need to make more than a year's growth. It would be interesting to me, informationally, to know, yes, 85% of our students made a year's growth, and of that 65% of them made suitable growth towards being where they need to be by whatever grade it is that we're shooting for. That, again, becomes a real piece of data that helps us understand if we're catching the kids up that need to be caught up.
Okay.
And I think that data's already gathered, isn't it?
On how many students are
Making suitable progress towards being on grade level at some point in the future.
I think there's data that we can grab, and I think suitable becomes the question.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I'd be interested in some feedback from the district about can we get that?
Okay, so I think I have some good direction around information that the board might want, and potentially some changes to the results policy. Again, we're not making any decisions, so I think I have good information about that. Do you have any questions, Mary, from what you heard? Is there anything you think you missed related to the results policy? And then I'm going to come back to a couple other questions.
So maybe it's not something that we missed, and maybe you're not prepared to answer it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts as the superintendent. Do you think those are realistic things that we can evaluate you on as a results policy? And I'm not asking now, but I think it would be nice to hear from you at some point in the future as to, and then have the dialogue with the board about whether in fact we have the right tools in there to evaluate you as well. I'd like to hear your viewpoints on it. I'm not asking for them now, but
Okay.
I mean, you're 6 months into the job.
Right.
You just finally probably got your feet under you. So I'm not asking for your input right now, but at least as one board member, I'd like to know your thoughts on that as well.
So I just want to answer that a little bit then, because I do have some thoughts on it. What we have to be careful about is anything we add to the results policy that detracts my attention from the work of the district and the goal. It shifts our district and how we perform. So that's just the caveat to it. I don't worry about the request for information and wanting to monitor things. I just think we have to be careful about what goes from information, because you need to, you want it, you like to know about it, you want to be sure that progress is being made, and then goes into the results policy. So that's the place. I think all the information, if it's an easy information grab, is the right information you should be asking for. I just don't know what little slice of it should go into the results policy. It's my initial thoughts.
Okay.
Okay, so there was a couple other questions that people were asking for that you thought you might want more information on. So I'm going to ask if we have consensus around those other pieces of information. So both Chris and Nancy had some form of, are students prepared for college or career after high school? What are their plans, and are they ready to perform? How do they persist in college? How many go on to four-year college? Those sorts of things come all around that statement, around 40, 40, 20, or whichever it is. So is that something the board believes is important information for you to have?
It also would include Chuck's CTE
Okay, yes.
stuff.
I guess the question I would have is, how much work is it to accumulate that kind of data, and what are we all going to use it for? I mean, I can see every now and then I might get asked a question like that, but I guess you have to value a little bit how much work the district has to put into it to get that kind of information. You're gonna be surveying kids, or are we gonna be, how are you gonna get that, and is all of that work worth it for, and I'd love to have that information too. I guess that's what comes to mind for me.
Yep. And does it?
How are you
can
gonna do that?
Right.
You know?
Yep.
And how intensive is that gonna be?
And what my thought is after tonight is if generally people say, yes, this is something we want, then we go back and say, here's what we already have for data points that is easy to grab. Here's what we don't collect already. So let's ask ourselves the question, how important is it? Would you change anything in policy governance and your policies and your work as a result of us spending 400 hours to get this work to you? That's exaggeration, but so that's what I was thinking.
be.
It may not be, right? So that's, I think, how we'll circle back with this conversation. If you agree by consensus that you think it's valuable to look at. We won't come back with the data. We'll just say, here's the data we can easily pull.
Chrissy, I don't want to put a value judgment on it, but I'd also like, I'd like to know, how is that going to inform what staff does with regard to the rest of the work in the district? Does it really inform and provide a tool to staff to help them meet the mission and goals of the district? You know what I mean? I want some feedback from staff, because you could say, yeah, here's all this data, and it's really great for school board members to know this stuff as we're talking to community groups or stuff, but does it change the way that we do our work in the district? I'd like to, it's okay for you to push back on that
Yep.
against us, is what I'm saying. I
Well,
guess.
and one example I was thinking about today is we do have some information out there about kids that go on to a four-year college.
Right, yeah.
And wouldn't that have been fascinating to compare that at a school like McKay from where they were to where they are, and has their work shifted as a result? Yes. So it can be useful, and it already is useful, but I appreciate that. Okay, the other thing I have is full day K, and kind of thinking in terms of what does this make a difference for kids academically, I think would be the way to, and Rick suggested this not as a results, but as we really need to be watching this to be sure that the expenditure for full day K is getting us the results we want. Right?
And won't we, Christy, won't we see that over time period with regard to, at least as the state has put it with our third grade reading?
Yes.
I mean,
Yep.
isn't that one of the bench measures? So we're gonna see that data that the state's probably gonna grab anyway, so.
Correct.
Okay. But yeah, I think it's important stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be important. I know that some districts, a lot of districts found that that there's a increase in learning for those who go to the pre-day K, but then sometimes that's often lost by the time they're at 3rd or 4th grade. Usually they're completely average with the rest of the student population at that. And so that's something that we need to know. If it's something that's not sustainable, if it just reverts back to whatever our average teaching is, then it's really money lost that we could have been putting into our general teaching.
Okay, yep.
Jeff just said that, and there's the thing that's buzzing around my mind, and this is, I don't want this in the information list and all that stuff, but it's a worry that I have, I guess is a good way to say it, is that there's a lot of concern, I know, out there in the population about Common Core and what its effect is going to be, or Smarter Balance, and what its effect is going to be on students. I'm really concerned by the fact that I believe probably 30 or 40% more of our students will be told every year that they're not meeting the benchmark. And what that does to our dropout rate and what that does to a whole lot of other things is yet to be seen. I'm also encouraged by Smarter Balance because I really believe that it's a much better assessment of whether our students are actually being prepared to go out into the world and be functional than the Oaks tests have been. But at the same time, I guess the worry is just what's the impact, and if we do full day kindergarten, does it really help 3 years later? And there's all these things that are out there that we worry about. And I just wish that our informational system kept us all really apprised of what the concerns are and how that's working out here. That's a good way to
Yeah.
say it.
Does anyone, I think you just were saying that, right?
Yeah.
You were just, okay,
That wasn't for
okay.
information.
I did not write.
It's just a
Worry,
worry that I have
okay.
that I wanted to throw out because I think all of us have our own worries. And I think it's important for all of us to know what we're worried about.
I have that same worry, and I think it's my job to worry about that, so, so we can talk about that, but, okay, and then the other thing I have on my list is all the other areas, info on how kids are doing in all the other areas, science, economics, civics. Is that information you think is, the rest of you think is important to have? Jeff?
That would probably depend on the cost. If it costs much time and hours of, or much FTE, I would say no, it's not worth it.
Okay.
I guess I always question, so we get that information, what are we gonna do with it? You know, is it a so what? So, like Jeff said, if it's not an economic issue as far as pulling that information together, we always like information, but I think you need to measure it against the staff time and everything else, and to be honest with you, I'd be interested in that information, but I'm not sure that as a board member, I'm gonna be able to do too much about it other than be aware of it.
Let me share why I think it's important. I think it's important because I really believe the old maxim that what gets measured gains value, and what doesn't get measured loses value. And the fact that we're not measuring those things and we're not paying attention to them simply says to people it's not as important.
I'm assuming
That's
it's
scary.
being measured anyway,
Yeah,
and
that
so,
would be nice to do.
I think the message that we have to have is that completion of high school is in our results policy. And taking science
Is a
and
requirement.
being successful in a science class
Is a requirement.
is a requirement. Therefore, we value the teaching of science and the teaching of, the things that are required to get a high school diploma. And that if our message is consistently, we only care about Smarter Balance, then we're not being fair in what we're representing, because we also are very interested in our high school completion rate going up. So,
My limited sample says that the teachers out there that are teaching those non-tested subjects feel slighted.
then we are not doing a good job of communicating to them how important it is that they teach what they teach. That's my point,
Yeah,
that we need to do a better job of that.
okay. I'm with you.
Okay, so there were a couple other things that came up. A couple comments about executive limitations, and Jeff's comment around if something isn't going well, being clear that we're making changes. So, any thoughts from those of you that mentioned some things around executive limitations? Go ahead.
When you guys did your summer planning retreat, you had this same conversation, and you did approve a change in the EL that speaks to if there is a material change, you do have a process in place for how you would be told about that before the superintendent's evaluation. So I'll put that back out to you so you can see it, that you did address this and you did make a change in your policy just within the last couple of months on that.
Good.
And I would be sure to disclose that before the evaluation, and you should ask me that.
I also think when we look at the results, when we have our data night, where we look at the results, that as a piece of that, there's conversation about what are we doing about it. I feel like when you bring those results to us, you don't just put them up and say, gosh, we didn't do so well this year, or we're doing great. I mean, they're brought forward with a discussion of what did this tell us and how is it informing what we're doing. So Jeff, I'm confused by your statement because I think we get that when we get that data presentation, which we get usually in the fall sometime when the state releases that information.
Jeff, question or comments or an example?
Oh, I agree that we get it, and I just wanted to make sure that it was clear for us and for everyone else that changes were made, and that was clearly part of the process. Not that it doesn't happen, but
Okay.
because I do remember us asking those questions during our last results.
And reinforcing that that's part of that data presentation, or whenever, if there's a violation of any of the executive limitations, same thing. Chris?
Just another
Okay.
thought that Nancy triggered. This year, when we went through the results, the very first set of graphs showed that, according to our results policy, the superintendent was doing okay as long as there were increases, getting better, whatever the wording is, for all of our subgroups on the state tests. And we saw for the first time since I've been on the board, some graphs that were going down. Then the folks led us through a deeper dive into the data. And we started to see that there were some things that were going on that were really quite encouraging down inside that data. It worries me, another worry, that the way our results policy is written, that we are going to end up writing a bad evaluation for the district/superintendent, because our results policy is pretty blunt force. It doesn't take the deeper dive, our results policy doesn't. That worries me.
That worries me too.
And
Yes.
when I read it, it doesn't worry me because the wording is reasonable progress. And in some cases, reasonable progress could be
Because we have a tougher
because of
test or a
changes.
new benchmark. or-
I've always felt we're covered on that because it's our assessment of, did the district make reasonable progress given the conditions they were operating under, okay? So,
Or lack of conditions.
or lack of conditions.
Lack of conditions. So we're just passing out the current results policy with some initial language changes around SBAC, which is all we've done with this. So just so you, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Just one of those.
So this is your, it hasn't done a very big rewrite yet. We've just taken care of SBAC.
Where's the reasonable progress? I don't see it.
It's not in there. It's actually who meet or exceed the state benchmarks, and that's one of the points I was gonna bring up, dovetailing with what Rick and Chris said, because let's take, for example, when we recalibrated standards, and we said the cut scores changed. Remember, math cut scores changed. The ELPA cut scores change. We're switching to smarter balance, which we already know a
Yep.
significant amount of our students who are currently meeting or exceeding because of the content and the content standards and how it's aligned with the assessment. Your evaluation wouldn't come out very well underneath this, Christy.
No, we
and I
have that
wanna make
taken care
sure-
of.
And I know in our staff linkages, it does talk about a reasonable interpretation.
It's in the evaluation
Yeah, it's in
policy.
It's in that linkage. Yeah, it's in the linkage. I think it's 2 or 3. Board staff linkage 3.
Yep.
And I just want to make sure that we're aware that it does allow for a reasonable interpretation, and we need to know, because one of the dips we saw, Chris, was they changed the cut score. But when you compared that change in cut score to where we were actually performing better still. So I just want to make sure we keep that in mind.
Okay. And it's in the policy. Do you think it needs to be it's in the monitoring superintendent performance? You don't think it needs to be in here too, Mary? Okay.
No, I just
No,
want to make
because-
sure that the board understands, we do have that as monitoring superintendent performance under BSL 3.
Yes.
In our board staff linkage.
Okay, yeah, and we'll come back with, looking at some of these changes next time, but we wouldn't get to a final draft until we've had this next step of the conversation around dropout rate and those things anyway. So just know this is our first stab at the SBAC language and how that transitions. And creating a baseline.
And then when you bring that back, Christy, are you going to come back with, or at least we can have a discussion about that long-term goal issue too?
Yes, yep,
Okay.
yep. We won't do anything with this until we've had, probably even, I think, another work session on results. So at our next work session, we'll bring, here's the data, we can pull this long-term information, we can't. Okay. I think I have what I need to go the next step, unless there's other people that have something that you think I haven't heard.
I'm not seeing any hands go up. So I'll take the meeting back? Okay.
It's all yours.
Okay, before I adjourn, I want to remind the board, we're going to have a executive session after this meeting, a closed executive session. And then on February 10th, after our regular school board meeting, at 7 o'clock or thereabouts, we'll have a budget committee meeting. It'll be the organizational meeting of the budget committee. And we all need to attend that as well. Okay? So let's stick around for the executive session. We are adjourned.
Okay, we need to clear the office.
So we need to clear the room as rapidly as we can.